Hi everybody, welcome and thanks for joining today's webinar, The Changing Vendor Audit Landscape, Expose Your New Vendor Audit Risks. I'm Kate Hallgood, host for today's webinar, where we'll look at the way in which the adoption of subscription-based software licensing has changed the way in which vendors are auditing their customers and the potential technical and commercial implications. So we're going to explore some of the risks that are still prevalent and how to uncover them. Today's presenter is my colleague, Niall Eddery, who some of you may know. He's our senior consultant here at Livingstone, specialising in IT asset management, software asset management and licensing. Niall's been with Livingstone for over 7 years, and during that time, he's used his experience in working for the likes of Ernst Young and KPMG to deliver over 100 audit projects for our customers. So at the end of this session, there will be an opportunity for you to put your own questions to Niall around audit, just by clicking on the button below that says Ask Your Questions. So Niall, I'll hand over to you now.
Hello everybody and welcome to the webinar. I hope the recent pandemic dramas haven't affected you all too much, and hopefully this will be a bit of a diversion. Okay, so today is all about exposing your vendor audit risk. And the agenda really is looking at, first of all, where should you focus? So what are the key things you should focus on when deciding where your risk might be? Once you've done that, it's how should you then approach that and assess that risk? Once you've found the risk, you're going to have to figure out how to deliver that message internally and who do you deliver it to. If you then get audited, how do you deal with that? So I'm not going to go through absolutely everything here. I could talk for days about that, but just some helpful points and tips, some of the sort of key things you need to worry about. And then just to keep it topical, what's the pandemic impact? And that will be sort of growing from previous issues we've seen come out of people's BCP plans. So probably the key piece around figuring out where you should focus is that it's not all about where you spend money. Far too often we see our customers come to us at the start and they're focused on their top 5 or 10 vendors from a spend perspective. Now that's great from a overall software asset management perspective and figuring out where that focus is, but you really need to think beyond that when you are looking at audit risk. You need to look at your deployment profile, so where the software is deployed, how much of it you have deployed within your organization. You need to look at the vendor profile, and we'll talk about all of this a bit more, and what the triggers are, so that when you're carrying out things that may be an audit trigger, you think about the audit risk first. So in terms of the tier 1 vendors, their programs are mature and stabilized. Microsoft is actually stabilized and having very little activity at all at the moment. They used to be one of the sort of most active vendors in terms of their SAM review programs. These days we are seeing some activity around cloud, still some legal or LCC audits, but even they're sort of toning down a bit. On SAP, still highly active, and we don't see that changing, is mostly centered on the annual certification process and annual renewal process. There is still talk about indirect access, but now they've got a license model for that. Some of the heat has been taken out of that conversation. Oracle has been much more focused on those high value customers that we see. So we are seeing where large customers with 8-figure value EULAs are trying to step out of EULAs. We're seeing audit activity there. Where customers are talking about, again, high value customers are talking about going to the third party support providers like Rimini Street, Support Revolution, or Spinnaker. We're starting to see audit activity there, or well, we're continuing to see audit activity there. But it's really focused on those high value customers, and the product focus is typically focused on the database, and that's largely down around capability. We are seeing questions around Java, but we're not seeing much audit activity around Java, and that's largely down to the fact that they are certainly making their revenue targets on Java, unlike a lot of the other areas, and there isn't really a formalized audit process there in terms of a technical audit process that works consistently. IBM is the same as ever. It's still got a very consistent rolling program, although we are starting to see some signs of increasing aggression with some compliance managers within IBM. It does seem to be localized to certain compliance managers and account managers rather than an overall practice, but this probably is something to be aware of. In terms of other vendors, these are a selection of the vendors we've seen audit over the last sort of 12, 18 months or so. Quest, OpenText, and Micro Focus, highlighted in red, are the most active and aggressive of the auditors out there. We see them being very pushy. We see them really focusing on a lot of the legacy contracts and significant changes in behavior and how they're dealing with those legacy products and contracts compared to how the vendors they purchase them from are. So a lot of the Quest audit practices are very, very more aggressive than the historic Dell practices in terms of interpretation of things like geographic restrictions and those sorts of things. For OpenText, again, another company that's grown up through acquisition, either through some of the legacy autonomy products, some of the EMC products like Documentum have gone in there, and again, a bit more aggression there. Micro Focus have always been one of the most aggressive in the marketplace, and we're still seeing that continue. Micro Focus in particular have been pushing things like a new support renewal contract that includes audit rights and actually tries to amend the perpetual rights of license agreements. In the medium sort of risk, either based on volume or aggression, we're looking at, say, Citrix and Veritas, who seem to be rolling and ramping up programs, still very, very active, doing lots of reviews. Not so much aggression with those guys as there is with the others, but still sort of medium focus just because of that sort of high level of activity. BMC, Software AG, and TIBCO, we're seeing sort of medium levels of aggression and medium levels of audit activity with them. So really they're just ones to focus on. And for the rest of them, there's a mix in there. So, Corel, highly active, send lots of letters, don't really do a lot of follow-up on them. People like Avanti focus typically on where maintenance has been cancelled, but take quite a softly approach to it. Whereas people like Dassault or 3DS, you might know them as, focus on places where they have seen pirate activity or believe that pirate activity may have taken place. So, other than the vendors, you need to look at the trigger factors. So what is it that might cause a vendor to audit you other than just it's your turn, which is what they'll all say to you? Are you going to terminate, or have you just terminated maintenance or exit an agreement? Audits are particularly good leverage there. Any issues with your contract? So have a look at what you've purchased historically and see, is there anything there that would flag mismatches, such as flat renewals over a significant periods of time. You might have had 500 licenses for a product for the last 8 years. Eventually, somebody at the vendor is going to do a piece of analysis that says this customer hasn't amended the number of licenses they have up or down for a period of time, and so they're probably just paying those renewals as they come in without any thought or any due process. So they look at those. Product mismatches, so we see a lot more activity from vendors where they are actually doing some data analysis in the background and finding that customers have add-on products without base products, or more add-on product licenses than they have base product licenses, or vice versa. And that's just driving activity there. If you're coming up to a major contract renewal and it's a high value renewal for that vendor, they are more likely to audit you, again, to try to push you into a renewal, to give themselves as much leverage as possible. Are you going to virtualize a legacy solution, and is the vendor going to know? Does the vendor know about this, or I should say, sort of put something in the cloud either? A lot of the time, where vendors are finding out through support or account teams that there's a virtualization project or a cloud migration project, that flags audits as well, because they see those either as a last chance to get revenue based on the current platform, or as an opportunity to get revenue off the future platform if they think it's going to be have more of a compliance issue there. Using professional services from a software vendor. This is relatively recent one that we're seeing more activity, and there's always been a risk here, but recently we're really seeing a couple of vendors start to push this, where you might engage a professional services part of a software vendor to do a migration for you or to provide a upgrade or anything along those lines. We're seeing some of that data make it back into compliance teams. If you're doing that, just make sure that you've wrapped that professional services engagement with some sort of confidentiality wrapper that doesn't, so that they can't leak it back out. Support team bounties. These have been in place for a while, particularly Microfocus. A support team member who flags an issue to the compliance team will make money out of it if there is a compliance issue. If your relationship is heading south, that can cause problems. So you might have had a really good relationship with the vendor. Something has tanked it. Maybe it was a major cloud migration piece that didn't work. Maybe it was an upgrade that didn't work. Maybe they really didn't act well, or they feel you didn't act well in a renegotiation, and it's caused some distress to the relationship. And then, of course, there's the software phone home. Dassault, Altova, quite a few other vendors' products will actually phone home to the vendor and say, this product has been activated with this key. And if they see too many activations or they see keys that aren't yours come through, they might cause audits. So how should you go about assessing what that risk looks like? Where, obviously the first step is what we've talked about, which is picking your high-risk vendors. But once you get to there, you really need to think about what the audit approach that vendor has is. So ask around, has anybody in your business been through an audit with this vendor before? What do they know about it? Do they know what the data requests were? Do they know how aggressive they were? Do they know where they backed down? Those sorts of things. You need to read all of your contracts in detail and understand absolutely everything and assume the worst case interpretation. A good example of this one we came across recently, where a customer had licensed software under a named user metric in the license agreement. They then signed a support agreement that said that a customer had, when they upgraded the software, had 90 days to discontinue use of the previous version of the software. And that was in a support agreement separate to the license agreement. And the vendor had actually used that, or tried to use that, to claim that the customer needed a separate license for every version of the software that a user was using. And in this case, it was that they had one version on their desktop, they were accessing a different version on the server. So in this case, the vendor said you need a different license for each version. And I'm just going to say, if you don't understand what you're doing, get specialist help, come to ourselves. There are other organizations out there. Obviously, I'd prefer if you came to us, but get specialist help if you don't understand what the audit process is, what the data is, those sorts of things. The key thing here is it's not just about the inventory data. You need to think about how the metrics are actually defined. So what is the definition of a named user or enabled user account, or what is the definition of a processor? Does that include virtualization, all those sorts of things? And does anything within the entire body of contracts conflict with that definition? Do you have a contract that has one definition of what a user is, but links to a standard terms and conditions document on the internet where that definition has changed since you signed the agreement? If so, which metric takes precedence? Do different versions of software have different EULAs and different definitions? Again, which definition takes precedence? You need to understand what the use restrictions are. These can be expensive, so you need to consider what the platform is. So is the license limited to just Unix, just Linux, just a set type of processor? Those sorts of things. The geography, is there a geographic restriction? Is there a limit on third parties? Have you outsourced your support since that contract was signed? And then you need to look at whether virtualization and cloud are allowed as well. To put this in perspective, Microfocus as a vendor will charge you 40% of the original license fee to add a third party use right to your contract in the event of an audit. If you do it as part of a ongoing maintenance renewal or a new software deal, it can be free or 20%, but as part of an audit, it's they're more than likely going to charge you 40% of the original license fee. That can be expensive, particularly if you've got a contract that says back interest is also allowed as well. You need to understand what data you need to calculate the metric. So you might have a per processor metric. If that's a per physical core, can you actually map the virtual machine back to a physical server or a number of physical servers and understand how the metric applies to those? Is it the entire platform? Is it just the high watermark of usage? That's just one example. If you're in a cloud-based platform and you've got that sort of definition, that's where things can get a bit hairy. So you need to understand what data you need to calculate each of the metrics. That's where part of finding out somebody who knows what the audit approach is, who's been through an audit before, or getting some specialist help really does help you out. So you need to get some data to help you assess that risk. So audit data requests are very, very complex and very product specific. So you do need to try to get copies of what those data requests where you can. Does it require an output from a set console? Is there a script? I've talked about some of those key data sources down below, and you need to understand what they are and what the impact of that is. If you can't get data to calculate the metric now, if you go to the database admin team and say, can you please tell me how many processors this uses, or how many users this is, or how many documents have flowed through this system, and they can't give that to you quickly, you probably are already non-compliant. Not just because your contract probably says you need to keep records, but if nobody knows how to get the data, nobody has probably been monitoring it, and it's either going to be a compliance problem or a savings opportunity. So you've been through this, you've gathered the data, you've figured out how many licenses you need, and you've come up with a compliance risk. And you need to bring this up internally. Now, you as a software asset manager, might report into finance, you might report into procurement, you might report into the IT manager. But you need to understand what the best way to bring this risk to the attention of your organization is. Probably the first step you need to go through, regardless of how comfortable you and your internal SAM team are with the risk, is you need to validate that risk and get buy-in support for the key stakeholders. And those key stakeholders, probably the first ones, are the technical and business owners. They really need to understand what the risk is, how you've calculated, and where that came from, and make sure that they understand what definitions you have used, and that if it doesn't meet their understanding of those definitions, you explain why and come to a common understanding there. Procurement and sourcing, you need to go to them and say, well, this is based on these contracts. This is what we've calculated the risk at, because they need to buy into how you've priced that risk up. You might have used list price. Does the procurement and sourcing think that that's just a complete over-exaggeration because, they believe that everything you do with that vendor should be at an 80% discount? If that's the case, you need to make sure that everybody is happy with what that risk number looks like. And legal as well. So if you are going to base something on a gray area in a contract, a vendor definition, or something that in particular, something that disagrees with the vendor definition, getting some legal coverage here is very useful. So you might have a definition that says users assigned to use the software. What does that mean? Does that mean if sort of all of the users who have access in the last 90 days? Probably not. But you need to understand, is there a logic that you can apply, and does it fit within the definition? Once you've come to a common understanding of the risk and you've got that buy-in support, you can use your internal risk management processes. So do you have a risk register from a financial perspective? Is there provisions on accounts? How does your organization manage that? Do your IT risk organization understand this as well, or your internal audit teams? It's not just a financial risk. If you look at the Mars versus Oracle case, Oracle threatened to turn off Mars's support and potentially terminate those licenses. That represents a fundamental IT risk if your business is built on that software. You need to be very careful about how you communicate within your organization, though. You need to be very careful of leaks. So some people may have very close relationships with the vendor and think that they know best. Maybe somebody has had a very good relationship with the vendor. They've been out for lunch together once a quarter. Are they going to try to resolve this themselves by having an offline chat with the vendor? That can cause problems. Is there a risk that some of this data will seep out through when people are raising technical support queries? Like, okay, so you're using version of 11 of a database, there's a support issue with that. Is there a risk that a DBA could send them data for everything if that data is available? Another issue is if you believe that there's a potential for legal action here, you need to understand what the discovery rules in your jurisdiction are. So if you're communicating information about a risk internally, if there's a court case in the future, that communication might come out as part of that court case. So if you've just said, oh, listen, send an email saying there's a 20 million risk here, and you're in error, there's a chance that if that communication comes out in future, the vendor might be able to try to show bad faith on your part. So you need to make sure that you've discussed how to deal with those communications internally. When you're bringing a risk to people, you need to go and figure out, well, what can we do to mitigate this risk? How can we approach this risk? Can we remove some software here? So, one business unit may have deployed too many dev servers in error. Can we remove those because they're adding no value to the company? Are there a bunch of users who have since left the organization in a console that you can remove? Is part of your mitigation plan to buy? So are you looking to do a different commercial deal with that vendor and soon? And is part of your mitigation plan to get some new terms written into that deal that might mitigate this problem? And again, working particularly with the technical and business owners here will help you develop that mitigation plan. When you come up with solutions, people are more likely to take the problem seriously because you're not just saying, I've got a 10 million problem. You're saying, I've got a 10 million problem, but with your help and your buy-in, I can make that a 2 million problem. And that's when you start to really get some traction. We do see in some of our customers a tendency to want to go, what we call go rogue or go maverick or go over people's heads, which is, oh, if I just float this huge number out there, it will get some attention. You need to be very careful with that, because if you haven't got buy-in from your business owners and your technical owners, and particularly procurement and sourcing, you risk undermining the entire process. So you need to that really is a last resort type approach to flagging risk internally. So that's all about the internal side of things. Now you need to talk about, well, how do you deal with an audit process? Probably the first thing is, somebody sends you an audit letter, is there even a right to audit? If you can't find a right to audit, ask the vendor for one. In fact, just ask the vendor to show that there's a right to audit anyway. For some vendors like Oracle and IBM and Microsoft, yeah, it's pretty clear. It's into your master agreement somewhere and everybody knows it's there. But for some of those legacy vendors, legacy products may not have had audit clauses. Your contract may have been written in 1991 and the vendor might not even have a copy of it. And even if they do have a copy of it, they probably hadn't even contemplated auditing in 1991. So therefore, there might not be an audit clause. You might find that there was a legacy enterprise-wide agreement for something. And as part of that, somebody negotiated out an audit clause because it wasn't necessary. Again, push back on the audit clauses. You do need to read all of your contracts, including the support terms, and I've given 2 examples of that already. One, there was something in a support contract that conflicted with the named user definition, and the second being that Micro Focus are rolling out audit clauses within support terms that amend legacy perpetual license agreements. When you're going through contracts, one of the key things that most people skip over are entire agreement clauses. So these are clauses that say, this agreement stands as a whole and nothing else can amend this agreement unless it is signed or written or under certain conditions. If you've got one of those clauses in agreement and a vendor sends you a copy of a click wrap EULA, it doesn't apply. So you need to think about where your click wraps or standard EULAs even executed. So if a vendor sends you a EULA, ask them for evidence that that was executed. If they can't give that to you, then how do you know that EULA applies? And sometimes in the process of giving you that information, they might give you more information that you can use internally. So, for example, they might give you a list of your purchases of a piece of software to show that you bought this software at a set period in time when a set EULA applied. That may be valuable information for you internally. So, somebody's established there's a right to audit, but what is the scope? So is there an organizational limit on scope? Is there a product limit on scope? Don't just accept that the right to audit transcends all of your business and all of your products. It might be one business area that signed a contract. It might be an audit right for one set product. So again, just understand that completely. Can you ask to delay that audit? Of course you can. And most audit clauses have a term that says it shouldn't unreasonably interfere with your business. If having an audit now is going to unreasonably interfere with your business, tell them. If you've already got 4 audits on the go and you're a team of 2 people, you probably can't deal with a 5th. Tell them that you can't deal with it right now because you've got other work on, you've got other scheduled work on. So therefore, you will agree to kick it off at a set time. What about cancelling it altogether? Can you do that? Well, that's a bit harder, but in some cases, yes. You might be able to say, use things like other commercial activities that are going on to cancel it. So if you have an RFP process that's just been published and a vendor was going to reply, you could tell the vendor that your internal RFP process says, or internal procurement process says, that a vendor who is carrying out an audit on your organization cannot be involved in any other commercial activities other than standard maintenance renewals. So therefore, if they want to go through the RFP process, they need to cancel the audit. That's just one example. There may be other reasons. It can be difficult to get it cancelled altogether. One thing to consider is third-party auditor versus vendor. Now, there are benefits to both approaches. I will say that third-party auditors can take a more independent view of things than a vendor can. They can potentially look at contracts with other software vendors. So you might have bought business intelligence solution licenses with a ERP system that are out of scope of the audit. The third-party auditors are more likely to take that into account than the vendor is. But going with a vendor means that they can see less of your estate because they have no right to see anything other than their products. It's a difficult one. It's a bit of a horse for course, and there is no set rule here. We typically tend to prefer the vendor, going down the vendor route without the auditor, really just because it's a simpler, more confined process that takes up less resources rather than anything else. But your mileage may vary, and there's certainly times that we've preferred to go through a third-party auditor. You need to think about what data you have to provide, and do IT security and data protection agree that you can provide it? You need to think about your NDA. So if you're going to provide, in the case of an Oracle script, a server name, server IP address, operating system version, software version, plus a whole bunch of usernames, plus MAC addresses, plus a wide variety of other information that comes out of those scripts, first of all, are IT security going to let you send that outside your organization? And if so, what do you need in an NDA? Do you need a vendor to sign up to a specific set of security terms and conditions to get certain data sets? In GDPR terms, what data is covered by it? So we have taken an approach, and it is certainly a risk-averse approach, that server names or computer names generally, IP addresses, MAC addresses, and anything that can uniquely identify a user, even if it doesn't have a username in it, could potentially be covered by GDPR in Europe. We've seen vendors say they want to be a data controller. So this has recently come up with IBM, where IBM are using a third party to audit one of our customers. And IBM has said as far as they're concerned, they are the data controller, even though they're never going to see this data. So we've pushed back on that because we don't understand how a vendor can live up to their obligations under GDPR if they never can have data in their control. So again, think about these things, involve your data protection people to make sure that you're not breaching your company's guidelines. Think about what the impact on you as a software asset manager would be if you unintentionally breached IT security and data protection laws. You need to think about, are the data requests reasonable and can they be executed without business impact? If you've got 6,000 servers with a particular vendor software on it and you need to run scripts, what is the implication for that across your business? Can you do that? If the audit clause doesn't say you must run scripts everywhere, then maybe think about a sampling approach, other data sources, manual declarations even. You need to just think about what you can do without impacting your business. You also need to think about whether or not the data that the auditor's request is available and if there's a proxy for it. And this is actually one that we had to deal with quite a while ago, where a customer had licensed a terminal emulator on a concurrent session basis, but never actually tracked how many concurrent sessions were there. They didn't put a limit on it and didn't actually have any logging on it at the time. And this was actually they did this as a result of a BCP event, so probably relevant to some of the stuff I'm going to talk about later. But we were able to show that even though there was no high watermark tracking and no controls over what the maximum number of users could connect is, we were able to say, well, actually, out of this entire user population, we were able to get the login details to say how many of those users had logged in every day, and we were able to show that those users hadn't even logged into the terminal service solution, Citrix, in greater numbers than the max concurrency. So we were able to find a proxy for that data source, which made the auditor go away. In some cases, you may be able to just get the audit done as quickly as possible. You may be able to talk to the auditor and say, listen, as far as we're concerned, we're compliant. We've got 100 licenses for this. We've got 20 users for this. We can't give you this data without an NDA. But if you want to go on a WebEx session, I can show you where we pull the data from. And as soon as the vendor realizes there isn't going to be any revenue in it for them, they may just go away and get out of your hair and save you a lot of work. But again, you need to assess that carefully. If you think about the report and closing the audit out, there's probably a few key things. You need to make sure you see the report before the vendor as much as you possibly can. And you need to include that in the NDA if you think it's going to be necessary. There's a few reasons for that. The primary one, you do not want a vendor getting an inaccurate report from an auditor, and this has happened many times before. An auditor may give a vendor a report saying, this customer, you, are non-compliant to the tune of £10 million. When you go through this, you might find that there are so many errors in this report that the reality is the non-compliance is only £3 million. But that vendor has already sat there and said, right, so they may have forecasted that they're going to get X amount of money out of it. They may have set themselves up. They may have told their manager about it. So effectively, by letting them have an incorrect audit report, you've made your life more difficult at the end of the process. You also need to make sure that if you've agreed that all data will be masked before it goes to the vendor, that has been done. You also need to make sure that, just technically, that everything has been done and that you agree with it. So, does the report include out-of-scope information? We have seen that happen on more than one occasion, where a keyword may have brought up a piece of software that the auditor was unable to reconcile back to anything, but they included it in the report anyway. You need to understand and check absolutely everything in the report. So does it reflect your understanding and interpretation of the contract? Do you believe that this contract allows you to virtualize, and has that been reflected in the report? Have they reported on one metric when you licensed it on a different metric? And this is one that we're going through at the moment, where a very old metric from prior to acquisition has not been included in the report. That's probably because the vendor just doesn't have the records, but we do, so we need to make sure that that has been included correctly. Have they made any errors? You would be amazed at how many formula errors there are in these things. not just formula errors. There may be linkages. Sometimes they may be in your favor, sometimes they may not, but just go through and check all of them. You may be asked by an auditor or a vendor to write that you believe a report is accurate. You don't need to do that, and I don't think you ever need to do that. If a report is going from a Big Four auditor or any other audit company to the vendor, all you need to do is agree that the report is good as a basis for further discussions. In some cases, what we're seeing, particularly with Quest and Micro Focus, is that the audit firms are just providing deployment data back to the vendor. And what we're seeing is that when they're collecting that data, they're using just standard terms and conditions, standard definitions. They don't have necessarily copies of the fact that you signed an amendment back in 2007 to allow a third-party access to your systems, or that virtualization is allowed in a specific scenario. What they're reporting back to the vendor might not even be enough to capture the metric that you have, or to calculate the metric you have. You need to make sure that you understand that completely, because otherwise you might be in a position where you are coming under pressure to make a settlement with a vendor on the basis of information that just doesn't match your contracts. When you're going through your settlement discussions, if a contract does not specifically include the right to allow interest on back maintenance, tell the vendor to remove it and that you're not going to pay it. They may try to make arguments that there was a clause about unpaid invoices that had an interest thing in it. It's not applicable in this scenario. Just if it isn't related to a compliance finding or an audit finding, tell the vendor you're not going to pay it, and then for the most part you won't pay it. At the end of the day, you do need to understand that this is a commercial conversation. It is based on commercial contract that you signed with the vendor, and while a adverse compliance finding may give the vendor more leverage, it is still a commercial conversation. So, is there a better metric to resolve a compliance issue? So, for example, in IBM, in the IBM world at the moment, you might have a subcapacity, full capacity issue, but at the moment, a lot of products are now available on a virtual processor core metric. So maybe if you convert all of your entitlement to one of those contracts, the compliance issue is a lot less. Think about what other business you are doing or planning to do with the vendor as well. Maybe you might be able to, if you had a plan to buy an extra licenses for something else later in the year, you might be able to roll this into the deal and effectively get them included for very little extra. Okay, so there's currently a bit of obviously drama about the whole COVID and coronavirus thing happening. What is the impact on the audit process? Well, probably in the short term, it's relatively simple. If you cannot resource an audit because of higher priorities, fewer available staff through illness, removing contractors, or having workers that just can't work from home and therefore can't function, tell them that this is currently an unreasonable business interruption. Likewise, if you put in a change freeze, you probably can't collect the data and people will have higher priorities now. So in the short term, if you can't respond to an audit, tell them you want to delay it or cancel it. But the key thing here is a lot of vendors are probably going to see revenue downturns here. There's probably going to be less IT change, less people buying licenses as the likely recession comes through. Companies are going to start downsizing, so license purchases are probably going to disappear. So we are likely to see higher audit volumes in the future. We've seen this with other vendors where, like Micro Focus, where as they lose revenue, just because of the nature of their business, they do increase their audit volumes. As we see revenue go down across the board, we are going to see higher audit volumes. And this has happened pretty much after every downturn in the economy. Since I've been working in the industry since 1990 something, You need to beware your own BCP plans and activities. In a lot of cases, just to make things work, your IT department may say just grant access to people. They may go through break glass processes or whatever else, but you may find that remote services applications, Citrix desktops, those things just get given out willy-nilly all over the place. One of our customers had this issue with the whole Sandy disaster a few years ago, where they actually granted a huge number of users access to a lot of software through Citrix just to keep things functioning. In that scenario, an auditor came through probably about 2-3 years later, and some of those issues still existed in the estate, and that actually had the potential to cost them quite a lot of money. You need to think about whether or not any applications were re-platformed through this process. So, as the ability to work on-site was removed, did you move any of your processes to the clouds or to other geographies? Have you effectively granted access to people in another region so that you can have support coverage? You need to think about all of those sorts of things. And have you automated any systems? So we're seeing more sort of, certainly on the consumer side of things, more self-service type applications coming out, where more people are pushing things through, online self-service type portals. If you've done any of that, how does that have a licensing impact? You need to start thinking about planning and assessing what has happened and cleaning it up very quickly afterwards. You will probably find that most of your vendors will be understanding for a certain period of time after this has happened. But if you don't roll back any of those compliance issues that get caused by your BCP activities in 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, or longer, they may come back to haunt you.
Brilliant, thanks, Niall. That's really interesting, actually. I think you've covered some really good points, sort of in the current state of things. That's been quite interesting hearing that. We've got a few questions. A few of them came up sort of earlier on in the webinar, but obviously held it back to the end to throw these at you. So the first one I've got is somebody's asked, when I find a risk, I struggle to get anyone to pay attention to it, but it seems like low priority all the time. You talked about risk registers. What are registers? What are they?
So risk registers exist in most businesses, and they can come in a variety of different formats. Almost definitely, your business will have a financial risk register that talks about risks to the business and what may have negative consequences for the business. They may have things about, it's only risks over a certain value. It may have sort of limitations on what type of risks can go in there, but I would investigate this. So, for example, BCP events are typically on a risk register and therefore have values and priorities associated with them. Just getting something on a risk register with a value means it starts to get exposed, first of all, to risk management type people in your organization, and then potentially, if the risk is big enough, up to C-level or board level. So it certainly can focus the minds if a risk gets on there. The financial risk registers may be referred to as account provisions, those sorts of things, and that's really just about people putting a financial provision in place to deal with a risk if it occurs.
So the next question is, I have a SAM tool, and when I try and bring up the compliance problems, it reports. But when I try to bring up the compliance problem, it reports no one trusts it.
Yeah, this is a fairly common one. So SAM tools have their limitations, and those limitations are based on the data they get and how that is manipulated within the systems. Our approach here at Livingstone has been and always will be to try to follow the audit methodology as much as possible, which may or may not involve SAM tools. SAM tools are usually a good source of inventory data, certainly usually very good at counting what we call instance-based metrics, so number of computers, number of processors, those sorts of things, but typically aren't that good. Oracle is a really good example. Unless you've got a very specialist SAM tool, it can't tell you what options are being used, those sorts of things. If you've got a metric that says that's based on headcount or FTE, so those things, the SAM tool is not going to have access to that information. So you probably find that historically there's probably been some credibility issues with the SAM tools and what data's come out of them. Maybe not taking all of the factors into consideration, like, you know, whether or not disaster recovery systems need to be licensed, those things. So I think that, you know, again, this comes back to focusing on the getting buy-in from the technical and product owners, as well as procurement, to try to make sure that if you're going to report a risk, that everybody agrees it's a risk before you start to report it. And if the technical owners don't believe that what your SAM tool is reporting is a risk, you'll probably get nowhere fast. So you need to start working with them to figure out, well, what the real risk is. And like I said, go back to the audit processes, find out what the data the auditors use to calculate the effectively compliance.
Brilliant, thank you. I think, well, I'm just looking at them. We're aware of the time now. I think we've got time for one more quick question here. Somebody's asked, procurement keep telling me they have a great relationship with Oracle. So they say we won't get audited. Have you seen Oracle or other vendors in situations like this? How sort of true is that?
Good relationships with vendors last as long as you're giving them money, is my experience. We've certainly had some very, very big customers recently fall foul of this with Oracle. You know, we've seen it across the board with lots of different vendors, you know, but it doesn't take a lot for a vendor relationship to go south. It might be just we're cancelling maintenance on a set contract, or you may want to move to third-party support for a small part of the product set. They might not be successful in RFP. You know, it doesn't take a lot for the vendor relationship to go south, and when it does, one of the first tools in their arsenal, or one of the first weapons in their arsenal or tools in their toolbox, is going to be the audit letter.
Super, makes sense. So I think we have hit today's sort of scheduled time. Niall, if you want to jump onto the next slide, there's some contact details there. If there are any more questions, there are a few other questions here which we'll try and get the answers out in the email I send out to everyone when we follow up with you. But if there are any questions, then do feel free to take mine and Niall's email addresses down and drop those questions over to us. But yeah, I'd like to thank everybody for their time, and Niall, thank you for presenting today. So thanks everybody, stay safe and well.